At any rate, that doesn't. Maybe we should get back to your original question. The you cannot deny that there was a folk song revival that became a folk boom, and that tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people in the world did see Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Tom Paxton, and so on as folk singers and singing folk songs. All I can say is that if scholars have trouble with those definitions, so be it. In a book, like Norm Cohn or Ron Cohn, any writer on it struggles with definitions. Once you define that which you are doing, in a book you have 300 pages to develop it. Here's where you have a problem as a film.
Wrestle with it.
You're not doing an academic book, so film is intended to reach broad audiences. You have to start on the assumption, and here I'm sympathetic with what you're doing, you have to start on the assumption that your viewers, or most of the viewers of your film, will have some memory, oral memory or visual memory, of Joan Baez or Bob Dylan as folk singers.
The way I see that, I think the folk song revival, or more accurately, the commercial folk music boom that Pete was so offended when we called it the folk song revival, I think that provides, for a lot of people still living and still active today, it provides a frame of reference, something that you can lock their memories into and their emotions, and once doing that, you can use it to bring on a Ralph Rinsler, for instance, or an Archie Green, or something, and talk about, or Pete Seeger talking about why he thinks that is different, and that's what we tried to explain to Pete a little bit. Which
I have no trouble with that. In fact, let that be your whether you state it yourself, or a commentator reads it, or you find a text that can be read, or whether it can be stated in a song.
Put it into a narrator's voice, and have someone say it.
Right. However you do it, that's a good way to open your film. How about just focusing on this term, folk song revival, or popular folk song, has been controversial from the beginning, or academicians and the public can never agree on the dimensions of the folk song revival. Right. Was there something called the folk song revival? Of course. Did it involve millions of listeners? Yes. Did it have value? Of course. Then, once that's put down, I don't suffer. Man, that's the last thing I do is sit around and suffer over whatever little role I had.
Well, one other thing is that I don't remember if this is something you mentioned the last time we were here, but I started talking about it with people in New York. I go into record stores a lot.
Sure.
And I buy lots of recorded music. And how much recorded music do I buy?
Do you go over to Chris, to Down Home Music?
I've been over there once. I want to go, years ago. I want to go over there again.
You should. That is the biggest stock to interview Chris.
Yeah, I want to talk to Chris. Is it Strakewitz?
Strakewitz.
He's
great. He's a big, blonde guy. He's from German. Looks like a German Nordic. He's a great guy. He's liberal, good businessman. Get his perspective on it.
I'd like to.
Now, he hates Mickey Mouse music. You'll learn that. That's a term he uses. He doesn't like aesthetically, he's not as tolerant as I am, but he likes his roots music.
Yeah.
Clifton Chenier,
his big thing is
Lightning
blues
Hopkins,
and Cajun music,
and hillbilly, and Mexican, Flaco Jimenez, Lydia Mendoza. Now Chris represents a deep commitment to traditional sounds, but from a business perspective, that he'll never be a millionaire, but if he can sell 2,000 or 3,000, it's ironic that Pete, who could sell 1 million copies, really wants to be a purist, and Chris Strakewitz, who doesn't can't sell 1 million copies is a purist. And those are things you can sort out.
Yeah.
But you should interview Chris.
You can go in the stores and you can buy the stuff that,
Right.
that Chris puts out on
Right.
Archie, is it? His
Our
level. You
Huli.
can buy,
Right.
Fred McDowell, Mississippi
So-
Fred McDowell, and you can see
Lightning
there was one
Hopkins.
that I haven't bought, but it struck. I think I want to hear it, but I've noticed this. It's on Folkways, now put out by the Smithsonian. It's Gene Ritchie and Doc Watson at Folk City, and I looked at this a few times, and
Right.
I've said to myself, okay, now here are two traditional musicians performing in a nightclub in Manhattan,
Greenwich Village.
in Greenwich Village in the early 1960s, and here in 1992, I'm standing in San Francisco, and I can hold this in my hand, and I can buy it, and I can hear that, and I think that that's a positive outgrowth of the commercial folk boom. I think it's taken a lot of people like Gene
Sure.
Ritchie and Doc
Sure.
Watson and put them
Yeah,
in the hands of people
Without
that would never
question.
would have
hear of
heard
them. Yeah.
without question.
And that's what, some of the
Yeah,
people
so-
Ralph Lindsay did, which was go and find
Well, Ralph pushed Doc Watson.
Yeah,
Sure.
well, he managed him for a
Yeah,
time.
sure. Well, because the term folk song revival, it's an umbrella term that covers. If you listen, Norm Cohn did 99. You have that
Yeah.
little
I have
set,
the collection of the book,
99
yeah.
songs,
Uh-huh.
and he ranges from deep tradition to the most current pop, and so it's no matter how broadly or narrowly you define the folk song revival, even at its narrowest, it's a broad umbrella term, so that someone like, say, Sarah Gunning, who came from Appalachia, to use an example, because she's available on 2 LPs. She had no commercial appeal. At the most, each record sold 1,000 copies. But she was an exponent. She was a pure folk singer by every definition, by birth, by belief, by education, by commitment, by sound, and by stubbornness. I told you the story, how she came back. She had been to Newport. You've got to get this story. I told it to everyone. I thought I told it to you. She went to one of the Newport festivals, and they had little tents, for the traditional
Right,
performers.
yeah.
And one of the assumptions, of course, was what you just stated, that if 50,000 people came to Newport, then they would hear Glenn Orland do cowboy songs, or Dorsey Dixon do hillbilly songs, or Sarah do Appalachian songs, and they did. But essentially, maybe you enlarge the audience from 50 to 250, but essentially most of the people came to hear the stars, the Gillan and Baez and Peter, Paul and Mary on the main stage. Anyhow, when Sarah came back, this was at Illinois, she stayed with us. I edited her first album. We were good friends, and I said, "How did you like Newport?" She said, "Great." And she was a poor woman getting a free trip to Newport and all. And it was fine. Yeah. Then, well, who did you meet there? Well, I met, and she named all the people, including Joan Baez. And I said, "How did you like Joan Baez?" I told you
Yeah,
the
you
story.
did.
She said something like, "Well, she's a nice young lady, but if I had more time, I could have taught her to sing." And so here, with millions of people thinking that Joan Baez was the canary of the folk song revival, or the Jenny Lind of the folk song revival, for Sarah could hear the inauthenticity in the presentation of Sarah's style. That was a style that Sarah knew in her genes, knew in her bones, a style she had heard probably in the womb. And so, but here's the point. Sarah was not distressed that Joan was making money out of Sarah's style. Sarah didn't pit her. Sarah didn't feel exploited. She was a realistic woman. She accepted it as a fact of life that Sarah sang for a few people, Joan sang for many. Joan didn't sing perfectly, but she was getting this stuff out. If Sarah had time, think of the self-confidence of being here's this poor old hillbilly woman who had such a supreme, calm sense of her own strength, saying, if I had time, I could teach her, I could correct her errors, as it were. Well, but here's the point. Both appeared at Newport, and many auditors did not make a distinction. That is, it became an umbrella term that could cover Sarah Gunning and Joan Baez.
Where do the Sarah Gunnings exist today? I'm wondering,
Oh.
is folk music, or the study of folk culture, something that can look, as we move into the 21st century, is going to increasingly just look into the past?
No,
I will tell you
no,
that
no.
in America,
Yeah.
I bet most minors are listening to Garth Brooks, for one thing.
Right.
So
We have no problem with that. But in the 1920s, they were listening to Vernon Dalhart on records and so on. As long as you have a mixture of folk and popular culture, will most citizens partake of popular culture? Yes. And before that, sheet music or circuses or minstrel shows. That is, unless you go back to a pure state of Eden where enclave groups are completely isolated and can only sustain themselves by their internal members of enclave groups by their internal culture. That's a long time ago, and that's a kind of a conceptual model. But I'll make the point very strongly. Are there people within occupational, regional, linguistic, religious, etc. groups that maintain traditional sounds, styles, performance modes? Yes. One doesn't have to do a census to count all of them to make the point. Last weekend, I was at the Gene Autry Museum for a Western folk festival. It was to honor the singing cowboy. And the singing cowboy that's a reified cowboy. That is, you had people in 1990, and they were showing film clips of Hopalong Cassidy and Gene Autry and so on and so forth, and they were inauthentic then. But in the midst, among the 500 or 600 performers, a man came from Lubbock, Texas, named Buck Ramsey, who isn't yet on any recording or any film. He had his cowboy hat, he worked on ranches, and he sang in what can only be called a pure style. That is, he was as authentic as any cowboy who sang for John Lomax. And those of us who were folklorists or traditionalists, we gravitated to him. And at every festival, there is someone like Buck Ramsey. There is someone. You see, our society is not geared to bringing those people to the surface, because he's not like Garth Brooks. He'll never be on. He might be invited to a folk festival. I liked him so much that I'm going to help him get someone who's working with him get a grant to do something with him. But there are black and white congregations all over the South where traditional sacred music is performed. There are regional festivals with unknown. See, it's not always with song where there's the old styles live. Now, the old styles are modified. You have to think of it kind of you have to do a model that comes from astronomy. Like, there's a folk universe and there's a pop universe. And in each universe there's a sun at the center, and then you have the planets. Now, this universe or galaxy, as we know, is hurtling through space. And this universe, the pop universe, and then the elite, maybe there are three. The avant-garde, all three are hurtling through space. they don't intersect, but occasionally a meteorite, leaves one and gets into the orbit of the other and isn't dissolved and strikes Earth. Radiation cuts through. Telescopes are now probing. At least that's a kind of an analogy. So you see, folk culture isn't dead. It isn't frozen. It continues. If you have folk society, you have folk culture. Though, unless you have genocide, if you have people, folk culture exists in Tibet because the Chinese are trying to impose Chinese hegemony on Tibet. Black ghetto youngsters with gas cans burning down their own community. They exist because they are set apart and put upon, whether it comes out in rage or music or rap. That is so. If you understand how enclave people use cultural expression to both to ward off external forces and to reinforce internal forces, that's a process you can't control. You can just comment on it. It goes on forever. But as that trajectory moves through, it's not only moving in space, it's moving through time. It itself changes, just as popular music changes. See, when Joan Baez was, say, performing, rap hadn't come on the scene. Rap was germinating in the streets of, say, of Harlem or West Philadelphia, but it hadn't come onto the scene yet. Say, in the country and Western music before Willie Nelson was not influenced by rock, but in Austin you began to get Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson, cosmic cowboy music, progressive rock and stuff like progressive country. At any rate, part of the study in ethnomusicology or in ballad scholarship is to study these changes. But I would caution you against seeing folk song or folklore as lost or in the past. Whether collectors today, before the folk song revival, only a few collectors reached the public. That is, Lomax in his books, Carl Sandburg in his books, that old guy in Kentucky, John Jacob Niles in his concert tours. But they reached a small audience. The folk song revival of the 60s did reach them. That's a starting point. It reached tens of millions of people. That now, if anything, I don't want to say it's dead, but it clearly isn't vibrant. So the young people the clones or the third generation Weavers or Kingston Trio or whatever, reach small audiences again. So that pop music continues to grow. So it's Michael Jackson and Madonna. There's no incentive now for anyone to. At least in 1963, Ralph could invite Doc Watson to Newport, or I could get Newport to bring Sarah Gunning. There's no arena or forum to do that now. But that doesn't mean that people in the Ozarks or people in the Siskiyou, there are hundreds of folk societies. They don't stop worshiping, they don't stop creating because they're not invited to Newport. Right. The reality is only a few were invited to Newport. It was fortuitous. If Ralph worked with Doc Watson. I worked with Sarah Gunning and Glenn Orland. Glenn's a great cowboy singer. Mike Seeger worked with Doc Boggs. Ed Can worked with Merle Travis and so on. There were just about 20 collector, scholar, entrepreneurs who put, and how many people could you push in your lifetime?
Right.
2 or 3, so that we reached, say, 100 traditional performers and involved them in Newport and the Smithsonian. That's kind of a miracle.
Is that it? Throughout the 60s and 70s?
Yeah, at the most.
Okay.
See, any college kid who could read and write and could wangle an allowance from his dad could buy a nice Gibson or a Vega, and fly to Newport. I mean, but for folk, well, you can do an empirical test. You can take someone has the program books of Newport. They're in libraries. They list the performers who were invited. With a computer, they run all of the names into the computer of every Newport Folk Festival, and then you could put a mark, T, traditional, P for pop, and just see the proportion. And the traditional are small.
Was it the same people who were brought to some of the smaller festivals like Chicago or Berkeley, or did they reach out to a broader
no. The way the process worked, first a folklorist had to find someone in Appalachia or the Ozarks, or like Faith Petrick. Remember we spoke about her? She found some people around. I think they found a blind singer named Kenny something up at Fresno, in the foothills above Fresno. If there's an incentive to look, you find someone. Then someone would be invited to Berkeley, or to a local coffee house, or to a 4th of July celebration, to something. We used to use the term discover.
Yeah.
Those people were there. It's not like discovering the Caribbean. They're there. Did I tell you how I met Glenn Orland, how that happened?
Yeah, you did.
Okay, that. So everyone gets discovered, but discovered by a person who has... I was a professor and advisor to a folk song club. I had access to a few $100s. I could get on the phone and phone him and persuade him to come up and stay with us. And Ralph did that with Doc Watson and so on and so forth, and Mike Seeger. But first they come to small festivals or clubs, and then the venue just gets bigger and bigger. And Newport and the Smithsonian were the 2 big venues. Now, Ralph quit Newport to go to... He told you that. He always tells it, to go to the Smithsonian, because Newport had departed from his notion of tradition. So that this tension that Pete internalizes and can't handle, we all faced it, but we faced it with different responses. So Ralph felt, as long as he could bring good people to the Smithsonian and bring them some prestige and map their virtues, or put their virtues on the map, that he was doing good work. I think most people most activists in the revival, not the record producers, but the folklorists and the festival producers, most tied their aesthetic impulses, that is, their belief in traditional style, tied it into some liberal or progressive or radical politics. There may have been some who were just completely... The youngsters at the University of Chicago were much less political than, say, Seeger and his friends, and they had a deep stress on the tradition. But most of the youngsters in the folk song club in Chicago were from well-to-do Jewish professional families, and these were youngsters who were into physics, mathematics, philosophy, and they came from families with pianos and fiddle lessons. They were part of of a cultural elite, and they had an appreciation for culture, so that they were pretty knowledgeable in what they did. There's one guy you should interview from that generation, Bruce Kaplan. Maybe someone has mentioned.
I've heard that.
Bruce is the head of Flying Fish Records.
Okay.
And now Bruce was Jewish. His father was a merchant. That was an expensive school, University of Chicago. What did he study? Hindu philosophy. He went to India to write his thesis. I don't know if he finished. He came back, and his dad died and left him some money, so he started Flying Fish Records. But he's mostly now into various forms of fusion jazz, of pop, but some folk things. But Bruce, as an example, if you can reach a variety of people, like Ralph Rinsler and Bruce, Norm Cohn, Ron Cohn, and so on, you'll have a good film. I might even make a prediction. Your film might end up being about something that you didn't anticipate when you
It's
started.
already about something that I didn't anticipate. We don't know where it's going yet, but it's about something we didn't anticipate.
That would be good. Let it grow organically. Suppose it's a film on American culture. I mean, how do we define ourselves culturally? What emblems do we use? What becomes emblematic in our society? And is it dependent on your ethnicity, your status in life? Do we really want a homogeneous, totalizing, even in popular culture, an American popular culture that envelops the... I mean, do we want a kind of a George Bush, Dan Quayle, a linguistic mode, in response to Murphy Brown, and or do we favor, even within popular culture, as much variety as we can get with an awareness of the different strands? That is, do we want Bruce Springsteen and say Madonna and Michael Jackson, to use three exponents? Do we want them to all to sound like what was that TV show that everyone says Dan Quayle, like Leave It to Beaver,
Right.
or Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy? I mean, we're not even talking about folk culture here. Just within American mass culture or popular culture, how much pluralism do we want to preserve, and what do we do about that? Now, from that perspective, the folk song revival was very useful, very positive. If you're a pluralist, the folk song revival helped in ensuring that American culture would not be homogenized too rapidly, would not become too universal, would not become monolithic. That is, even as pop culture homogenized folk music, the appearance of folk music in pop culture's domain was a sign of pluralism. That's how I interpret it.
I'm wondering, though, as you say that, if what broke through to mass acceptance was anything except what sounded very popish.
It had to sound pop to
Peter,
break
Paul, and
through.
Mary and the Kingston
Right.
Trio were probably the biggest sellers,
Right.
and their stuff all had this nice sheen to it.
Right.
I like Peter, Paul, and Mary, but
Music. You're right. And I covered that even though Peter, Paul, and Mary doing, say, Barbara Allen or the Four Marys, or I'd have to look at their repertoire to see some really traditional songs that they did, which they did, or Rosemary, remember that old child ballad that Simon and Garfunkel did, Scarborough Fair.
Yeah.
Okay, even and clearly in the version they used in the movie The Graduate, And remember, they really worked two songs together and made it. I thought it was so mushy. Most kids in fact, I used that in one of my lectures. Did anyone listen to it sufficiently to know that it was an old child ballad? Most of the kids didn't. They didn't know what the hell the words meant. But even with that popularization or homogenization, here's an important point for you, that somehow the general public identified Scarborough Fair as a folk song, say, as opposed to Smoke. I never heard anyone call Smoke Gets in Your Eyes.
Right.
That was a pop song, and or what was Hoagie Carmichael, wasn't there? If you take certain pop hits of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, they were just, there was some recognition that somehow Scarborough Fair was a folk song, though in style it was completely assimilated into popular style. Yet, with all that assimilation, folk song helped broaden pop song. It helped give it a plural base and a plural meaning. I think that's a pretty important cultural point, to think about and develop. That is, what's the... in that way, you don't have to worry about whether see, only a folklorist worries about whether Blowing in the Wind was or was not a folk song. For me, it was not. But did the listeners think of it as a folk song? Yes. He wore Levi's. He had a kind of a rough voice. He had a guitar. He was against the system.
So it reminds me of a letter I read in Sing Out just the other day, written probably 1965, while they debated the merits of Dylan playing electric guitar wildly, issue after issue after, and somebody wrote that a letter that said words to the effect of, well, Bob Dylan has abandoned the folk songs he wrote just a few years ago. And I chuckled at that after listening. The folk songs he wrote a few years ago.
Right.
I said, Pete would have trouble here.
Plenty of...
That's what their generation thought. That's what people resent.
But they did. The public thought of that material as a folk song. They thought of those people as folk singers. I remember once... I think Dylan had a bad automobile accident.
Yeah, motorcycle.
And I remember the headline. It was Bob Dylan, folk singer, falls off motorcycle.
Right.
And just a headline writer has to condense. And did the American they didn't say Bob Dylan prize fighter, or Bob Dylan Hindu priest, or Bob Dylan screen star. That is, was he accepted as a folk singer? Yes. So you can either debate the thing, or you can try to get at what that meant, why that acceptance in that period.
Well, in the early 60s, I forget which journal, but one of the academic journals, maybe New York Folklore, did a symposium on the revival while it was happening. They had Erwin Silver and Ellen Stecker just there.
Right.
I remember. And somebody, either Erwin or Izzy, I don't know to what extent Izzy was a scholar, if he is at all. I don't. But somebody said folk singing is what people who like to sing folk songs to sing, and it was a circular kind of definition. Happy Traum in an interview told us
well,
that.
That's a struggle. I think I have a. Let me just take a second and see. I think I have a book here that may be useful to you.
Oh, yeah.
You may stumble on the folk revival broadly in music, crafts, food, and so on. You might jot down it was Donna Reed, R-E-I-D. She would. It had been an exhibition curated in the East, and it came out here. And she's a PhD folklorist. You can tell her you're a friend of mine, R-E-I-D. She's in the history department at the Oakland Museum, so there's no problem tracking her down. Now ask the museum in Massachusetts, in Lexington, Massachusetts, put out a catalog, paper-bound. She'll know the editor. She gave me one. Now, I suspect it's in the library or bookstores. There's a very good essay in there by Robert Cantwell, Cantwell, on the...
Ron Cohen just mailed it to me.
That book?
He copied the Cantwell essay essay only.
Yeah,
It's the one on. Oh, okay. It's the one. It just jumped. It's the one on. He deals with that important song. He takes a certain song, Tom Dooley.
Okay.
He says, "As Tom." All right, you have that
I
at
have
home?
the article alone, just the Cantwell
Okay.
article.
Well, if Ron cited the name of the book,
He's got the cover page on it.
yeah,
Remember, that's where we
get it
started,
out of the
yeah.
library. It's a good
Yeah.
book. But Cantwell is now in. You want me to give you his
Yeah.
address?
Oh, yeah.
He wrote a book on bluegrass music. Cantwell's brilliant. Anyhow, he'd be a good person. He was at the University of Chicago as a student. He played the guitar.
Did you know the people who started the festival in Chicago in 60-61?
Yeah, what?
Did you know Nick Gravenitis? Was he one of the people who did that?
I don't remember his
Okay.
name that early, but there's a guy who works for Bruce. If you phone Bruce Kaplan at Flying Fish Records, a guy who works for him is named Mike Fleischer. I guess Fleischer. He was in the Folk Song Club on their first festival, so he could give you some really good history, and maybe there's some photographs, stills. But Cantwell is at 919-382-1904 in Chapel Hill. I'll give you his home address. 5704 Cascade Drive, Chapel Hill, NC 27514. Now, he really knows a hell of a lot about the revival. If you've just got 10 participants, Ralph, myself, Pete, Bruce Kaplan, Bob Cantwell, Norm Cohn, you'll get 10 different responses, but that would be fascinating. The inability of cultural arbiters in America to even agree on the phenomena in which they participated. So where do you go for the ultimate definition? Is it the producer at CBS Records? Is it Mo Ash? Is it Ralph? Is it George Wein? See, George Wein was the jazz promoter at Newport, and he hopped on to the revival because he saw the money in it. And then Pete was his... See, part of the reason Pete, I think, is so troubled by the whole commercial thing, when Pete... See, I don't think Pete was used, but I understand what he means. That is, George Wein got Pete to head a board to have a folk festival at Newport, and Pete's idealistic. I'm sure he didn't get any real money out of it, and maybe the performers got $50 or $100, but Wein made a lot of money, and he built a big stage, and he put his family on the payroll, and Wein used the Newport Folk Foundation to make certain concessions, like they'd buy a woolen sack for a school, or they gave out a little, let me put it bluntly, in philanthropy there's supposed to be a fair distribution of income, with say 15% for internal administration, 85% for foundation purposes. The Newport Folk Festival never reached that goal. It inverted that goal. And everyone all the people on the board, like Bruce Jackson and Peter, Paul and Mary and Mike Seeger and Ralph, and they struggled with that. And the question was, do you expose it and then sort of kill the goose that lays the golden egg? That is, do you break with Ween and his commercial exploitation of the foundation, or do you go along figuring at least he's making some money and we do some good? Well, each individual has... I was never on that board. Luckily, I never had to resolve that dilemma. Ralph resolved it by quitting Newport. He tells people Newport wasn't traditional enough, so I went to Washington, took my experience, and started the Festival of American Folklife. And Ralph, he must have told you this, he came up with the name Folk Life to contrast it with the stress on folk song at Newport.
Ralph had tried to introduce crafts to Newport. It never went over.
Well, it made a little token appearance. Yeah, he brought some sheep shearers from Nova Scotia and so on. Right, and it didn't work. So but underneath the differences that, see, Ralph could express his differences by going elsewhere and doing something closer to his model, but no one brought up the question of the distribution of the philanthropy. That's still, there's no one's...
And he did not talk to us about that.
No, it's too... For people...
In fact, he talked well with George Ween.
Yeah. Here's the problem. As I said, I was not on the board. People on the board had a struggle with that, and guilt gets suppressed. Once you make whatever rationale you make, you repress the tension. But there are some who will talk about it, who have no reason to hide it.
That's getting back way back. There's a film that professor I showed at the University of Colorado. His name is Stan Brackage.
Never heard of him.
So I'm going to call him and see if he
Great.
That's like you talk to people and people tell you.
Everyone will give you. Everyone will give you someone's name. You might call. I'm going to give you Donna Reed's phone number. She's in a museum in Oakland, and she might know of some footage because she curated this the exhibit on the folk revival. Now, the value of her work was that it was beyond music. It dealt with crafts, with food, with art, and so on. Donna Reed. That's the name of a pop star, but that's not my Donna. In the Oakland Museum, that's what, 510-238-3842. Give her a ring and tell her you'd like to go over someday and talk to her. You know where the Oakland Museum is, about that. If she had some clippings on the exhibit. They also made tapes that were played in the, as part of the displays. But we should just keep in touch as this thing develops, because I'm
close by.
We
enjoy it, and
it